to Property Summits, the show to tune into to find out all about the latest developments in the property world. I'm Emma Birchley, and joining me today are 6 of the most experienced people in the business. Now, first off, we have Ranjan Bhattacharya, a man who's been developing and investing in property for 30 years. We also have Tony Gimple, the one in the know when it comes to tax, accountancy or succession planning. Also joining me is Nicholas Wallwork, an investor, developer and author who's also the owner of the world's largest property forum. We also have Richard Bush, founder of the crowdfunding platform Crowdlords, which provides more people with the chance to invest in property. Here too is best-selling author and serial entrepreneur Paul Mahoney, a real expert in the world of buy-to-let. And finally today, we have John Howard, a man who knows a thing or two about property, having bought and sold a staggering 4,000 houses, apartments and developments over more than 4 decades in the industry. Hello to you all, gentlemen. Lovely to see you again. So today we're going to look at prices in the capital and also how they reflect prices elsewhere. So what is going on with pricing of property in London?
Well, I think it's worth thinking about London and worth considering that London is really almost a separate country to the UK. We often talk about the UK property market and UK property prices, but what happens in London and also central London and outer London is really quite different to the rest of the country. And I think one thing that we've always got to remember with London is that unlike any other city in the UK, London is an international city. When you check into a hotel anywhere in the world and you arrive at the reception desk and you see the clocks behind the wall at reception, you'll always see Paris, New York, Tokyo. You won't see Birmingham, you won't see Manchester, you won't see Blackpool, you won't see Hull, you'll see London. You'll see London. London is the international city you'll see when you check into any hotel worldwide. And I think London has had a very interesting dynamic, particularly central London, in the last few years in terms of it hasn't really moved that much. Other areas of the country have improved, have increased in price quite well over the last few years. London has stayed relatively static, rental yields for residential property particularly low. So it hasn't had any of the growth that the rest of the country has in recent years. But we also see some interesting things playing out. The fact that it's an international city, the fact that the UK currency is so low compared to a lot of other world currencies, the fact that high net worth people from around the world are looking at diversification from their home currencies into assets, which can't be inflated you can't money print property in the same way as you can currencies. The fact that visas and things have been given to folks in Hong Kong to help them settle here, and a lot of those folks choose London as a centre. So there's a lot of factors that mean that the people that buy, particularly in central London, the market for those properties is not people in the UK, but internationally, which kind of gives it a different dynamic to some of the rest of, say, outer London and the rest of the country. And I think that over the next 5 years, we're likely to see what always tends to happen in London, which is it goes through years of not much happening. And then when there's growth in London, it's double digit year after year, and then it pretty much stops. And we are pretty much due in the next uptick of the cycle, a period of double digit growth in London, simply because there's a lot of catch up to play from years of not much happening. And I think some of the opportunities for UK investors aren't in central London, the Zone 1 areas, in places near Hyde Park and all of that, but in the Ripple areas within the M25, but in the outer reaches.
And the Elizabeth line actually has extended those options,
Elizabeth line is going to be a fantastic opportunity still. I think one thing, people often ask me, what would I do if I wanted to invest in London? I think one thing that will become a rarity within 5-6 years in London is a freehold for pretty much under £500,000. There are still places in the M25 where you can buy freehold properties, and families like freehold properties, houses, gardens, that kind of stuff, as opposed to flats. Those sort of assets are becoming they will become increasingly rare to be able to buy a freehold house with a garden in the M25 region over the next 5 years.
So if you get the chance, they're worth having.
They're probably worth picking up, particularly if there's a short-term lull in growth in the next year or so.
But Ranjan, you're talking about yields of 2 or 3%. Apart from one or two, or quite a few selected investors, admittedly, the person, someone getting onto the property ladder now to invest cannot afford to buy in these areas.
You're absolutely correct. The central zone is pretty much 2%.
Yeah.
And the investors there are looking to have a safe haven for cash.
And capital
and
growth at
often
some
a safe haven for cash outside of the currency that they earn most of their money in.
Yeah.
And what tends to happen in those central areas is when you look at your returns over 10 years, the returns come from capital appreciation rather than rental income.
No, I understand that.
Rental income washes its face if that.
And 384,000 people last year bought for the first time outside London, although they lived in London, they moved out to buy.
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
Well, that is happening because people get more for their money, the remote working aspects and all of that.
It's not even possible though. I mean, I know someone who's trying to do exactly that, 30 years old, a teacher on quite a good salary, and partner's an artist, and they cannot get enough to buy their first place in London, and they're in East London, they're in Leytonstone, so they're going to move out to Suffolk and go and live with the dad to raise enough money for the deposit. It is tough for people, isn't it? I mean, just people can't afford it.
London is tough for people in ordinary jobs to get a foothold. You have a lot of people in what really are quite good jobs living in houses of multiple occupation. They're not able to afford their own place. And part of that, we've talked about this in previous programs, is the planning system. Unlike many other areas of the country, in London there are several boroughs that impose a small sites contribution. So, like if I want to build 3 flats in Islington or Camden or Westminster, I have to pay £50,000 per extra dwelling I create.
Crazy.
As a one-off charge to the council to help them, I don't know, maintain their town hall building or change the carpet or whatever it is, or I don't know, they do all sorts of nonsense with it, pay for their pensions, but it's for nothing. But it makes it uneconomic.
Index linked.
Ranjan, a question on the blue chip status of London, which I agree with. Although I don't base my investment decisions on what's behind hotel desks, I do agree with that London is a blue chip city and people want to park their money here. But don't you think that mostly applies to central London? Places on the outskirts of London, deep East London, deep West London, they're not blue chip.
Deep and darkest, yes, possibly. Where
You
it's
could be
tube
living
line.
anywhere, basically.
Tube line is important. But what we see is their ripple effect. So when you're in zones 2, 3, 4, and even parts of zone 5, you still get a lot of that ripple effect.
I think you'd argue that they're the better value areas, the further out that you can still call it London, especially for foreign investors. If you're, and the market is driven by a lot of foreign investment parking their cash.
Nicholas,
if you can have that, and in 10 years' time, it's going to double because it's still London.
Well, I saw a development brochure that was obviously targeted overseas investors, and they were calling Luton London because of the name of the airport.
London Luton. Well, they're just spelling it.
I think you can call it Ipswich London because it's 55 minutes on the train to London from Ipswich. And actually, if you're in some of these outskirts of Ipswich, outskirts of London, you could spend more than 55 minutes.
So when we have the high-speed rail, Birmingham will be London as well. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah.
Well, what I'm saying is,
We'll just call the UK London.
some of the more long distance areas outside London that are called London still are actually not really London at all.
No.
They're not that nice an area to live in when you can go to Ipswich or somewhere like that, much better, much cheaper, and you're only an hour from London, which is probably the same distance as it takes them to get into town.
What I think is interesting, though, to go back to your point about London being a micro market, is with Brexit and then COVID and everything that's going on at the moment, rather than crashing or dipping substantially, where parts of the UK are already on the decline, as we know, it's only kind of leveled out in London. So actually, will London crash at all? Will it go down at all? We've had people move out because of COVID, but I think they'll be creeping back in their droves. And I think there's huge pent-up demand back for London.
Central London or Greater London?
I think Greater London as well for the people that live in England. I think Central London for the foreign investors. I think they'll flood back in the coming 2 or 3 years.
I disagree. I think they call it, they say it's London, but you're an hour, 45 minutes on a tube from Central London. I think these areas are vulnerable because there's much nicer areas, better quality of life to live in, that little bit further out, and it's not much further time-wise to travel.
Since COVID, what we've seen is that particularly the younger generation, the under 35s, they're flocking back to London in their droves because the leafy suburbs where there's just one
they're not the only people.
Village
they're
cafe
not the
or
only
whatever,
people,
it's not that, there's not much happening for them, you see.
Ranjan,
London is
another
a
question on
happening
what you
city.
said there. You mentioned that you said, and I tend to agree cycle-wise, that London is due for growth, whether it's double-digit or not. I think London, if you look at a cycle, it's due. It's been flat for quite a while, right?
Yeah.
It dipped and then it was flat. But how can we have double-digit growth in a recession?
No, I didn't say we'll have double-digit growth in a recession. I'm saying that we have got a period of plateauing. And when we have the next uptick in the cycle, I think London will catch up tremendously because it's not just recovering from the dip that we'll see in the recession, but it's recovering from a few years of not much happening at all.
But isn't the problem with London that, because you made the point about, Brexit and the impact that had, and then COVID, and the importance of external investment into London. We had a project that we picked up that was being funded by Russians in London, and they could no longer fund it, and so we picked it up at a good price. And my point is that the risk, I think, for central London is that it's reliant on external events. Yeah. So whether it's the people coming over from Hong Kong, or whether it's no longer Russian money coming in, or whatever it is, and therefore it's not really a true market because it's driven by opportunity or distress that's happening in other countries, counter-cyclical perhaps to our own economy. So it's really difficult to...
But that's always been the case because
it has always been the case.
Central London, Zone 1, has always been an international city.
Absolutely, but that's my point. And that's why it's always behaved separately from the rest of the market because it's not part of the market. It's being funded externally, it's being owned by people externally and so on, and not even being lived in typically. So, it's I think it's quite a risky area for that reason. It's impossible to predict.
Whether it's overseas investors, whether it's people buying purely as an investment or somewhere to live, ultimately the desirability will be based around commutability, availability of work and infrastructure. Doctors, dentists, GP surgeries.
Those external investors who only know London, they don't know Reading or Brighton.
Never heard of anywhere else.
They don't care about any of those things. They're buying because it's London and they know London in the same way as we know New York and Paris and wherever those clocks are from. It's irrelevant whether the transportation is good or the infrastructure is good or the schools are good. It's completely irrelevant.
Unless, after they've bought, nobody wants to live there because the infrastructure isn't there.
But they don't live there anyway, that's
as a side issue, central London is one of the best places in the UK to be taken to A&E because all the specialist hospitals are within a stone's throw away, but that's another subject.
And you will have private medical insurance if you live in central London. So.
Yeah.
And if we're talking the ultra 1%, they're land banking. They don't care if anyone lives in it.
No.
All the embassy buildings, all those huge Pall Mall, Holland Park buildings that are vacant. We went and saw a £25 million ex-embassy building that's up for sale at the moment, and it's been for sale for 4 years. They don't care. They do want to sell it, but they're not going to sell it cheap, and they can afford to hold on to it.
Can't believe you bothered going there.
Well, I was looking at it as a second bolt hole to London, John.
Of course you were.
But I think the interesting area, Ranjan, is the area around the outside of the central London, isn't it?
Yes.
Because that's more like Birmingham and it's more like the other cities.
I think it's more vulnerable. I mean, I know some smaller banks that won't lend in London.
Really?
They won't develop in London. They won't lend to develop in London because they're cautious about the London.
Because the prices are so high.
Yeah, because the prices and also they don't see value.
Well, even if you're talking about Hounslow or Hackney.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point, and I noticed that as well. And it's a shift from 5 or 6 years ago.
Sure, yeah, I agree.
Similar type banks would only lend in London.
Absolutely.
And now they won't.
No, they all want to go to Birmingham, don't they?
Well, yeah. I remember 7 or 8 years ago, it was hard to find a lender in Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool because everything was so London-centric. And now all of the major lenders love those areas because they're doing well.
One of the great opportunities is actually in smaller developments in London, particularly around permitted development and converting.
I thought we'd get onto that subject at some point.
And converting.
I didn't know he knew anything about permitted
converting
development.
shops and uppers. In the 30s, when the tube network grew, you had all these villages which were linked by tubes, and then between 1930 and pretty much up till the end of the last century, what happened is all those villages became connected. So every road that connected, say, East Finchley and Finchley Central or whatever air tube station, whatever the road was, those residential Victorian properties on the main sort of roads became shops. So in London, every former village is connected to each other by masses of shops. And they're all in properties that used to be, all those shops used to be houses. And we have far too many of them in London. And because of the land values, there's tremendous opportunity for taking these properties, which are in secondary parades, there's oversupply of these shops, partially converting them to residential use, using permitted development rules, which allows you, if you know what you're doing, to get it through the planning system far faster. And in areas, we talked about the £50,000 small sites contribution, permitted development flats that are created are exempt from that small sites contribution charge. So, and these are sites where, if you're looking at a former betting shop, in some East London town, you're not going to get Barratt Homes interested in redeveloping that. Whereas a smaller time developer can come in and pick that up and make 2 or 3 flats out of the thing and have a very, very nice little scheme there, provided they know what they're doing.
Ranjan, what's out of interest? What happens to the shop element? Are they being converted into flats as well, or are they being kept? Okay.
It's a mixture. It all depends on is it worth keeping as a shop or not? And that's dependent on footfall and whether.
So you have to prove that it's not viable as a shop?
In a conservation area, it's up to you. If it's not in a conservation area, you do what you want. But if it's in a conservation area, you have to do a viability statement on the impact of losing that shop. Okay. But you can make that shop smaller and put a flat at the back if you've got light.
Oh, can I stop you there, Ranjan? Flat at the back, they're really attractive, aren't they?
They can be. No, they can be.
Who the hell wants to live in a flat with hardly any windows at the back, no garden, no nothing? It only works in these parts of London, of course. It doesn't work anywhere else in the country.
I was going to say, would you want to live there if you did have the frontage? Do you want to have a flat where you've got the kebab shop next door and the betting shop next side?
Well, it depends. You're talking about, again, it's extremes, isn't it? What you're looking at are, if you're going to totally convert the shop, it's streets where they're secondary or tertiary parades, meaning there's not much footfall. It's got that residential vibe anyway. You wouldn't do it in a street where there's lots of busy shops all over the place because no one would want to live there. Oh. So you see some of these parades where there's literally 3 shops and everything else is residential. Those are just fantastic candidates.
No, and you buy the lot as a freehold.
And in somewhere like London, people do forego desirability for location.
Of course they do.
Yeah. I saw I think it was 15 square metre flat or something in Chelsea for 1,500 quid a month the other day, and the bath was in the wardrobe.
Well, can I just say, I was looking in the window of
Wet your bed. I mean, it brings a whole new...
I was looking in the window of a Little Venice estate agent, and there's a 1-bedroom flat for 2.25 million. And I thought, it just depressed me when I think how hard I've worked all my life to have a home that's worth reasonable money, and a 1-bedroom flat in central London.
You've really got to want to live in Little Venice, though, haven't you, to spend that money on...
It's all relevant, isn't it, to what you've got?
But building these kind of things, it's also about the rental market.
Yes.
It might not be about selling it. Yes. So you're always going to rent to someone that will take a less desirable area for a reasonable rent than someone buying the same flat. So a lot of these could be built to rent schemes, of course.
Some of the properties we're talking about were actually built in Victorian Edwardian times as houses.
Yes, I agree.
It's commercial to residential, commercial, and back to residential.
But the whole reason why PD came into force was because the local authorities would not allow these shops and commercial premises to be converted into residential, which is what they were in the first place. And I've been arguing for 30 odd years prior to PD. It's crazy. These were residential houses. They bunged a single-storey shop on the front, basically in the front garden, and the government got so fed up with it, they said, enough is enough of this, we're going to force you to do it, and that's what they did.
So going back on some of the things we've covered today and in previous episodes, regardless of whether it's a PD or a shop or a small flat or the 2.5 million, one bedroom in Little
2.2 million.
Sorry, 2.2 million. What's 300,000 between them?
It's a whole street.
Whoa, just the one street.
Careful.
Just the one street.
It's a garage in central
We'll
London.
get lots of complaints if you say that.
And a free bee's nest to move. Sorry,
Yes,
John.
thank you for
That's all right.
reminding me.
My pleasure. The thing that's come across from this particular piece is that find your buyer first. You know, if you're going to develop, you're going to go for PD, or if it's going to be for renting. Well, hang on a second. Why drive yourselves crazy, or somebody who wants to be into property? Surely, start where you want to finish, and that's who's going to be my buyer, who's going to be my tenant, who's going to be the commercial, etc. And if you've got that, bingo, happy days. You've pre-sold, pre-let. It takes a degree of risk. Good God, I'm actually talking about
How
risk.
do you find someone though? Do you mean someone specific, or having a concept of who you want?
Well, you've got to start with the concept, and if you can find somebody specific, so much the better.
But how do you do that?
You pre-sell it. Can you ask her, okay, so if you know that you're going to convert a warehouse into purely residential, right, well, before you even start, or to raise the finance, who's buying that type of property?
There are risks around that, of course, of pre-selling.
True.
There are a number of people that have pre-sold developments that over the last
Especially
2 years...
in London.
Well, not just London, but Birmingham and other places where the cost of construction and delays with COVID and the market's gone up, but they can't resell them because they've pre-sold them and they're making huge losses. So, it's not the answer.
No, it's not the answer. That thing was from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Knowing your market is the answer, because when you look at a development, the first thing any investor or developer should be looking at is who's the end user. Who's is it dinkies, double income, no kids? That's what we call them. Is it people with a bigger house who are selling it to move into a smaller property?
What do you call them, John?
We just call them older people like you and me, Richard, who downsizers, who want to perhaps lock up and go because they want to buy a place abroad as well. Is it first time buyers? You need to know your market, and Tony's absolutely right on that. And it doesn't matter if it's London, does it, Ranjan, or anywhere else in the UK. That is so vital, is to know, who you're going to be selling to or renting to.
So getting back to the point, at the moment, who's keen on London?
Outer London, Greater London, or...
Well, I suppose that's the difference, isn't it? Central London or it's Greater London?
What I always think, whatever happens in London happens everywhere else eventually. I know Ranjan, Central London is totally different, I agree.
Yeah.
But everywhere
So take
else,
that out of the equation.
Take out the equations. I would say whatever happens in London, it's like a wave. It goes out. So, for instance, our estate agency in Norfolk, people sell in London, move out to Essex. People in Essex move to Norfolk to retire, and it's a wave. And I always think whatever happens in London happens everywhere else eventually. So I hear what you say. I respect what you say, Ranjan, that you don't think the market's going to drop, and that's your opinion. You've been at the job in London a long, long time, and I totally respect that. And I hope that's right. I think if it plateaus like it has done at the moment, it carries on like that, I think we'll be fine. My worry is in certain areas that aren't so nice, outside the London, but within the London borough, if you like, of Greater London, that may not be the case.
I think one of the advantages of, particularly the last thing I talked about, where you're going in established areas and looking at converting shops or commercial properties to residential use, the area is already proven. We're doing a project at the moment in Richmond, 5 minutes walk from the river.
Very nice.
It's highly, highly desirable. And it's not like you're banking on a brand new area that's got everything to prove, and it's a proven place. So I think that's what outer London kind of offers, and there is an opportunity for smaller time developers to operate in niche strategies to do some interesting things.
Okay, well, sadly, gentlemen, we are out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much for joining me today, and thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.